Today's Age-of-DOS game is kind of a special one in that it was, quite literally, the first game ever made for MS-DOS computers. Even though the game itself is technically a booter game, not a DOS game, and it's also a port from even earlier computer hardware. But anyways, the game is Microsoft Adventure. Now, I know I've said in the past I wouldn't review text adventures on the show because, let's face it, there's not really much to look at here. But because this represents the first game for a DOS PC, I'm making an exception. Plus, this is going to be a somewhat different episode than normal, as I'll be spending a bit more time focusing on the packaging than I normally would, and a lot more time focusing on the history of the game. Something I usually avoid talking about because I'm not good at researching historical aspects, but I'm going to try my best for this one because it deserves it. As for the game itself, those of you who've been watching shovelware diggers or are well versed in old text adventures will immediately recognize this as Colossal Cave Adventure, as this game has been ported so many times to so many platforms by so many different people, it's kind of been a bit ridiculous. Well, that said though, now that I've had a chance to play this game properly, I actually finally understand why I've never been great at text adventures. And it has nothing to do with the quality of the game, but I'll go more into this near the end of the video. Now, normally it's easy to explain which companies are responsible for making a game, but in this case, it's a bit more complex than usual. The original game, known simply as Adventure before becoming Colossal Cave, was developed for PDP-10 mainframe computers by William Crowther back in 1975, originally being considered completed in 1976, and then a year later was expanded upon with the assistance of Don Woods. Now, as it expanded beyond its mainframe roots, Microsoft would end up enlisting the help of Gordon Letwin, operating under the business name Softwin Associates, to develop a version of the game to be sold commercially for home computers. Now, this conversion was released originally for the TRS-80 line of computers by Microsoft in 1979, with an Apple II version coming out in 1981, and that same year, IBM helped to publish the version you're seeing now for their brand new 5150 line of personal computers. Seeing as the initial release of this port was for the TRS-80, it doesn't surprise me that the IBM version runs in a 40 by 25 column monochrome text mode, though you can use the F1 through F8 keys to change the text color to any of the low intensity colors from the standard 16 color palette. Well, there's also no audio anywhere in this game. As for its current release state, well, this particular version of the game is still under copyright, and thus still considered commercial software, but nearly every other version out there is freeware, so one place I recommend you head to if you want to download or play a completely legit version of the game, which plays pretty much the same, but isn't this specific version, would be the Colossal Cave Adventure page, which is found at rickadams.org/adventure. As for physical copies, well, seeing as this was a launch title for the IBM 5150, the first DOS PCs ever created, it's no surprise this game has become highly collectible. We'll take a look at the physical details in a moment, but just be warned that if you want a physical copy yourself, they're very rare to come across and very expensive when you do, with complete copies in decent condition fetching anywhere between $100 and $250. Well, normally when I want to show the physical media for a game, I do unscripted unboxings, but in this case, seeing as my copy isn't fully boxed, and because I want to focus on a few details with greater clarity, this part's totally scripted, and I'm just showcasing some footage I captured ahead of time. But yeah, as you can see here, the game actually comes in a typical plastic IBM folio of sorts, with two sleeves on the inside, one for storing the disc, the other for storing the manual, which has been perfectly sized to fit in its sleeve. You can also see here that the person who sent this to me, Anonymous Freak, included a couple interesting extra bits, such as this IBM memo slip that's been filled out with a message to me with appropriate checkboxes X'd in, as well as some hand-drawn notes and maps from way back when, though he wasn't 100% clear on if these notes and maps were his or someone else's. The disc itself tells an interesting story too, since as you can see, this doesn't actually look like a typical IBM diskette. Now, IBM discs usually had a gray label with a white ring around the center hole, but this disc has a blue label with a black ring around the center hole. Now, as far as I can figure out, this indicates a later run of the game, especially given that IBM would begin to use colored labels when publishing games not long following this one, but there's a much bigger tell than this even. Every 5¼ inch diskette IBM put out back then has a 4-digit code on it where the first digit represents the last digit of the year the disk was mastered in. Now sometimes this was printed on the label, sometimes not, but the disks themselves have the code very faintly printed onto them, and the one on this disk here is 2348, meaning this specific disk was mastered in 1982, not 1981 when the game was first released. As for the manual, it's not very thick, but has a couple interesting surprises beyond its full-color cover. Well, the first is that it's not black and white. Now, to help differentiate between text displayed in the game and instructions provided by the manual, a dark green color of text is used to represent stuff copied verbatim from the game, with the expected black text used for everything else. The other surprise, which absolutely no one would ever figure out on their own accord, is that despite the disk itself being copy protected, the game has a built-in function for creating one and only one fully functional backup disk by typing *backup when the game asks you to select your save game on startup. This is kind of interesting on a ton of levels, just by nature of what that would entail, and the fact that there's no way the resulting backup itself could be copy protected, at least not in any meaningful way. The process also has you constantly switching back and forth between the backup disk and the original, and once it's confirmed done, the original is altered so that the process can never be attempted again. I have no idea what the result of this process is, so if anyone has any clue, feel free to chime in. The history behind Microsoft Adventure starts in the real-life bed-quilt cave found in the state of Kentucky in the United States of America. And the game's original creator, William Crowther, along with his wife Pat, were avid cavers, people who explore caves, and both of them were part of a group tasked to explore and map parts of the many cave systems found throughout the state, in conjunction with research being performed by the Cave Research Foundation. Now, in 1972, they both moved out to Boston, Massachusetts to take a tech job with Bolt, Beranek and Newman, also known as BBN Technologies. In 1975, however, the Crowthers had gone through a divorce, and not long following, William began to feel as though he was becoming estranged from his two daughters. And his idea to help prevent that from getting worse was to make a game he felt that they'd enjoy, taking aspects of his time in the caves and mixing it with fantasy role-playing. A Bedquilt Cave in particular was a great choice to use as a template for this adventure because he knew it extremely well, having once plotted out its many twists, turns, ups, downs, and notable rooms with amazing features. In fact, those who visited the real cave and have also played Colossal Cave Adventure immediately recognized the vast number of similarities between the two. He originally wrote the game on a Digital Equipment Corporation PDP-10 mainframe computer in the Fortran language, and once the game was finished, he showed it to his daughters, and they both enjoyed it. And then pretty much left it at that. Given that much of what William was doing for BBN involved helping to develop the ARPANET, the progenitor to the internet that we all use today, and given that William had left to go on vacation shortly after finishing his game, without really telling many people that the game was even there on the system, well, other people at work started to find the game and subsequently started to leak it out across the network to other places. Thus it started appearing on mainframes elsewhere in the country, sometimes seemingly by magic overnight. One person in particular who played the game in this manner was Don Woods, who was working at the Stanford Artificial Intelligence Lab at Stanford University in California at the time, and just happened across the game one day on a particular computer it'd been loaded onto. Now, interested in developing the game further and expanding upon it, he needed to get in touch with its creator to obtain the source code. There's just one problem. The game wasn't credited to anyone. Don's only clue as to who the author might be was a message in the game telling people to send complaints to, quote, Crowther. So Don's bright idea to find the author was to send out some emails. Now, let's be clear about something for a moment. This is the very early days of cross-location networking. The internet didn't technically exist yet. Instead, you had various networks set up across the country, and while each network operated in similar manners, they weren't all connected to each other. Not at first. The ARPANET was one such network primarily in use by the military and educational sectors of the USA, and at the time, there weren't really a lot of servers connected to it. So Don's idea was to send out a bunch of emails to the following address on screen, Crowther@blank, where he would fill the blank in with literally every server on the network. And thanks to a stroke of luck, this actually worked. Don got in touch with William, who was more than happy to share the source code and see it expanded upon, leading to the particular version of Colossal Cave Adventure most people remember today had they played it back then. However, this is unfortunately where William Crowther's and Don Wood's role in today's story ends. They would indeed continue to be involved in stuff related to the game they created, but the vast majority of clones and recreations of Colossal Cave Adventure would lack their involvement entirely, nor would they earn any royalties from such creations. And Microsoft Adventure is indeed one of those unlicensed clones, which is extremely ironic given Bill Gates' open letter to hobbyists, which he himself penned just a few years prior in 1976 to call out the rampant software piracy occurring at the time. This was so early on in the history of computer software that no one really gave any thoughts as to ownership and copyright when this stuff was made, and in a sense, they were kind of openly abusing this lack of regulation. But then it could also be argued early innovation and ideas would have been stifled if not for the constant sharing and redistribution of code. Now that said, translating Colossal Cave Adventure, a mainframe Fortran program, into something which could be run on home computers at the time wasn't trivial by any stretch of the imagination. Microsoft tasked their employee Gordon Letwin, operating under his own business name of Softwin Associates, to make the attempt. And the main challenges to overcome were RAM limitations and differences in architecture, as home computers operated very differently from mainframe systems. Now, the solution Gordon came up with was to rewrite the entire game in assembly language, as this is the only way to make the game fit within the limitations of the time, as well as to have the game load different parts of itself off of the disk into RAM depending on where the player was located in the game world. The saving and loading also had to be handled differently, though any aspects of the game related specifically to mainframe mechanics, such as time sharing, could be removed. The first version of the game Microsoft published came out in 1979 for Tandy's TRS-80 line of computers. Now, while Microsoft worked on an Apple II port and negotiated with IBM in regards to producing an operating system for the home computers they were intending to release, IBM wanted Microsoft to also create a port of Microsoft Adventure to be part of their launch lineup of software. Now, given how tight the memory restrictions already were, there was no way Microsoft was going to be able to get the game to load from DOS. So it was released as a booter game instead, where you would boot the computer with the disk already inserted into the drive, bypassing any need to boot an operating environment. As you might expect, Microsoft's release of the game makes no mention of the game's original authors anywhere, although it does make reference to it being a complete recreation of the original Colossal Cave Adventure. So at the very least, anyone familiar with the mainframe version of the game at the time would understand what that meant. Plus, advertising it as complete was a notable selling point, given that clones of the game up to that point were not the complete adventure, given the amount of effort it took to get the whole game to fit within the memory limits of home computers at the time. Even though this game is just a text adventure, seeing as it's perhaps the first text adventure ever created, it works a bit differently than most such games out there. In fact, one of the very first decisions you make at the very start of the game is crucial, and that's whether or not you want the game to give you instructions. The thing is, this not only affects your final score at the end, but there's a lamp you find early on, and the amount of time this lamp lasts for is increased by saying yes to instructions. The irony, though, is that the instructions really don't tell you a lot about how to play, save for one pertinent piece of info: that all commands only consist of 1 or 2 words, and that only the first 4 characters of any word you type in are checked. With this in mind, you're going to rapidly discover that the game really doesn't give you a lot of flexibility in how you do things. Rather, instead, it's looking for keywords to infer what you intend to do. And if the keyword could apply to multiple things, it'll want a second keyword to indicate which thing you intend to apply to it. Well, there's a couple good examples of this in the early game. The first is that anytime you're faced with a particular location or route to a location, you can go that way simply by typing it in. You want to go inside a building? Just type in building. Want to go down some stairs? Just type in stairs. The game also knows how to recognize cardinal directions as well as up and down, so when all else fails, those can help you move around too. The other example of the keyword system in action is when dealing with obstacles. The game automatically assumes that when you want to use a particular object in a particular way, the thing to use the object on will either be there or it won't, so just use it on that. Want to drive away a snake with a bird? Just type in release bird. Need to kill a dwarf with your axe? Just type in throw axe. Also keep in mind that because of the way this works, you never have to put 2 nouns together. Every valid command in the entire game is either a single noun, direction, or a verb followed by a noun. However, right at the start, you're going to encounter the first weird thing about the game, and that's the map. So even though most of the map of this game follows a logical progression, where going north from one room to another means going south puts you back where you were, not every room works like this. And in fact, some rooms are designed intentionally to be easy to get into, yet hard to get out of by messing with this. And the forest at the start of the game is one such area. It only consists of 2 rooms, a primary forest room and a secondary forest room. The primary room is the one almost every path leads to, and if you enter it, west and south movement goes nowhere, east movement takes you to a valley, while north movement sometimes brings you to the secondary forest room, and sometimes not. From the secondary forest room, south brings you back to the primary forest room, east or west takes you to the valley, while north brings you back to the road you started the game from. This forest is but a taste of how absurd a few of the paths later on get. You're also going to discover pretty quickly that you have a very small inventory limit, but one thing you're not going to discover easily at all is that the way the game world responds to you can vary solely by either having or not having certain items, or even by quantity of items. Once you enter the cave, you quickly come across both a black rod and a wicker cage. Naturally, you're going to pick these up. Then, not too much further into the cave, you find a bird. If you attempt to catch this bird, it just gets scared and tries to fly away. So how do you get it? Well, the game's not going to tell you, even though it pretends that it will. If you try enough times to clear certain obstacles, the game recognizes this and asks if you're trying to do something, in this case, catch the bird. Now, if you say yes, the game will then offer to give you a hint in exchange for points. However, this hint system is extremely deceptive, as it won't actually tell you what to do. Instead, it simply tells you if you're in a state that allows you to do what you want to do. And if not, it simply tells you to return later. The funny thing is, I actually didn't have to. To catch the bird, all I had to do was drop the black rod, and then the bird was no longer afraid of me. Thanks, game. Way to go making me think I was missing something when in fact the problem was not missing something. Another important thing to note, which is additionally important if you're mapping this game out, is that every room has a generic name, and a counter is going in the background to track how many times you've re-entered rooms. Now, the first 3 times you re-enter a room, which includes attempting to move in an invalid direction, the game will simply give you the short description of what room you're in instead of the full description. Now, you can force the full description to appear by typing look or examine. However, every 4th time you re-enter a room also re-triggers the full description to appear. Also being tracked in the background are the dwarves. Now, the first time you encounter one, it'll throw an axe at you and miss, giving you an ample opportunity to pick the axe up and begin to utilize it against the dwarves. So long as you're only facing a single dwarf at a time, you'll always have the upper hand and should be able to kill the dwarf without issue. However, if you get unlucky and end up facing more than one dwarf at a time, you're probably screwed. I think there's a way to get out of a multi-dwarf situation, but to be completely honest, I only had it happen once the entire time I was playing. And when it happened, I died. The game's actually nice about this at first and offers to resurrect you. However, it can only do this a few times before the game runs out of its, quote, magic orange smoke. And keep in mind, though, that every time you respawn, your items get scattered everywhere, save for the brass lamp, which always ends up back in the starting building, since it would be pretty much impossible to progress without it. So you may have noticed I skipped a few things. Yeah, even knowing what to do and keeping a map, I just couldn't get very far into this game. And I think I saw a grand total of between 20 and 30 rooms out of the over 130 claimed to be in the game, though I'm not sure if that's counting the empty passages or not, cause if it's not, then I missed substantially more of the game. In fact, the manual splits the game up into 3 sections of cave, the beginning section, mid-section, and advanced section. And if you get all the treasures out of the cave within a particular amount of lamp time left, you're offered a chance to make a Grand Master run in an attempt to achieve the highest rank possible. But for me personally, I'm an extraordinarily visual person. I don't learn well from reading text or from listening to someone speak. I learn best from watching visualizations of explanations, going over diagrams, or just flat out looking at pictures. It's how I've been my entire life, and actually explains a lot about some of the weird difficulties I had as a kid going through school, as topics that had visual components to them stuck in my mind very well. So basically anything artistic, mathematics, as it was often demonstrated through diagrams, geography, science. If there was a visual component, even if just a small one, it clicked in my mind rapidly. But topics like spelling, history, second languages, even assignments where we're supposed to just flat out read something, I struggled with those. Some of those I got better at over time, like spelling, but even nowadays, if I read stuff with nothing visual to tie into it, what I read ends up jumbled in my head, and within seconds, I'm already forgetting what I read. This was a sticking point for me when I was taking dramatic arts, as it took me forever to memorize even just a handful of lines. Even now, voicing scripts for this show, I'm basically reading the script at the same time as I'm voicing it, and anytime you see me speaking direct to the camera is entirely ad-libbed. And this is why I had difficulties with Microsoft Adventure. Despite manually making maps and notes, my brain just couldn't keep up with the associations between everything. I was getting lost, cross-referencing things constantly, forgetting the simplest of directions to get from where I was to where I wanted to go, and on top of that, wrestling with the puzzles as well, especially given how some of them tie into both what you are and aren't carrying. Even walkthroughs didn't help, because the only way to follow any of the walkthroughs I found was to literally run through them exactly. You couldn't just dive into them at specific points. Plus, some of them said to do things which seemingly had no effect on what was going on, and without describing why I was doing those things, I was just getting even more confused. I knew I was screwed the moment following walkthroughs turned out to be just as difficult. But this just makes the game a bad fit for me. Suffice to say, there are tons of people out there who enjoy text adventures, interactive fiction, and all those kinds of things, where the text is the most descriptive and pertinent part of the experience. And Microsoft Adventure, aka Colossal Cave Adventure, is actually really well thought out given when it was first made. Throughout the game are interesting references, many of which relate to caver speak, such as the Y2 you find on a rock in a particular room early in the game. That rock actually exists, for real, out in Bedquilt Cave. Even the Zizzy code you get early in the game, spelled XYZZY, is a reference to how students are taught to memorize the equation for calculating the cross product of two three-dimensional vectors. The fact that the game world so accurately mimics a real-life location strictly as text with a layer of fantasy added in really shows the level of effort which went into this. And I would say that every person who's into text adventures absolutely needs to check out this game, because it is the great grandmother of all text adventures, and helped set the stage for every single one which would follow. And since there's a zillion versions of this game out there, many of which are free to play, there's no excuse not to. Since no aspect of the game is timed in any way, leaving cycle set to auto when setting this version of the game up in DOSBox is perfectly fine. However, trying to run the game off of the original disk may prove challenging at best, given the way DOSBox handles booter games. For me, I found the simplest solution was to acquire a pre-made disk image file of the game, and then while inside DOSBox, you simply use its boot command along with the disk image file you want to boot, and there you go. Anywho, that's all for episode 260 of Ancient DOS Games, and what will be the last full episode of ADG for the year. But before I go on my usual 2-month hiatus from the show to rest, recharge, and tackle other side projects, I'll be releasing a filler video next Saturday on the 19th to address a few things that have come up over the year, as well as to discuss what to expect for the rest of the year and what to expect for 2020, so be sure to stay tuned for that. Thanks for watching, everyone, and extra special thanks to everyone supporting me on Patreon. Here's just a small selection of you guys.